machinima production decreasing? Tracy, since you specifically wrote about that, why don't you kick off with your thoughts on that subject?
I don't think the number of machinima films is reducing as such. I think what's happening is there is a shift change as to where those films are being created and viewed, and what the expectations are of those machinimators. I think the expectations of that community are shifting and changing. So I think we have a creative community that's grown up with machinima, which is what you've tapped into with the Expo, Ricky. And I think there's another community, much bigger community emerging, that's sort of taking shape on the likes of Twitch and Steam and elsewhere, and that's tapping into a different cultural phenomenon, which is still machinima, but it's a different place. So I actually only think that it's shifted in a different direction. It's not that there's less of it. It's just that it's more hard to reach for the original community. What's very interesting is that the people that are tapping into it these days don't actually know it as machinima. They don't describe it as machinima. And I think one of the other things that I saw was actually even the people that are very familiar with it as machinima and use it as part of their creative portfolio are moving away from the term machinima, mainly because they're trying to position their work in its creative form rather than the medium in which it is created, if you like.
I see. What are they calling it?
Animation, real-time animation, I think was one of the terms that I heard. There was a few terms that kind of cropped up. I'll remember them as we go along. But I think real-time animation was one of the ones that struck with me most.
Well, you also have to ask, why does people get into it in the first place? I think that there's definitely a subversive element where, I'm going to hack this game to do something, and you earn some points in order to make those technical leaps. But there are also those who see it as a time-saving tool by not having to use the 3D Studio Max, by using assets that are already created. And as far as the time-saving goes, what I see is kind of a transition where there were no iClones or things like that in the early days. Therefore, you had to use the games and bend them to your will. And then it went through this transitional, the movie storms and so forth. But those tools began to age out, and that's what I saw with the Extra Normal was kind of like the initial wave in the industry tried to catch that wave and say, a lot of people are doing this, let's give them a dedicated tool. And they weren't able to properly, monetize that. And that's kind of how I look at it, as it's going through phases. You have machinima, and then there's a reason why Hugh, sold out, and then the machinima channel became kind of like this new kind of a game culture thing. So the term has lost its meaning because of that YouTube channel, and all the value is wrapped up in kind of a reality show, selfie sort of a culture of like, I'm a gamer, you're a gamer, and we're going to hang out online, and we're going to talk about games on the webcam, rather than I'm a storyteller. I want to tell a story through games. So somewhere along the line that was lost. And so the question that I have, which I'd like to hear your opinions, is how demographically, how many people really aspire to tell stories, in society, or they see themselves as creatives or artistic, rather than kind of more of a casual surface, attention-getting mentality, which is where I think most of the quote machinima is these days. Record the game, talk smack about the game, that kind of a thing. More of a sports thing.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think our whole culture has moved more towards celebrity, and I think it's probably just a question of the machinima phenomenon is wrapped up within the broader cultural trends that we're seeing. I mean, it was certainly something that came through in the research, whereby people that I were talking to were saying there's less emphasis on the quality of the creative work, and more emphasis on using the creative work to generate audience and celebrity status for themselves. although having said that, in the the research that we've published through that report on the project website, I don't think the findings actually stack that through. But I didn't actually manage to get to many Let's Play gamers, which I think is where that really applies. I didn't manage to tap into that cultural phenomenon, but certainly I would say it's a general cultural trend, not necessarily just one that we're seeing in machinima.
Yeah.
It's kind of the X Factor phenomenon, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's really the fact that machinima hasn't really, and I'm speaking more on the game machinima, hasn't really broken in like in so-called mainstream entertainment. I mean, the whole gaming culture really hasn't hit a lot of people. They don't realize how big it is and how much, the revenue generated in the gaming culture is. It's like, and I know I have a couple of boys who are in that, and they, they're all into the Twitch TV, which I'd never heard of before, and the gaming culture, and so it's big out there. But it's not like you're reading it on Us Magazine on the newsstand or anything like that. It's they've got their own little promotional, and they live on the internet, and so I guess I mean. Having said that, I don't know that the directors here or the people here who make machinima, we're kind of I see that as like the tightest realm of machinima. The people doing the game is they have their strict definition, and then we have our expanded definition with the iClones and the movie stones and the movie zoos. And I actually went out to the 48-hour film project to say, well, what do they call it? And they refer to as motion capture environment, such as OpenSim, Second Life, and/or animated software machinima, such as iClone, World of Warcraft, and I don't know why that's in that category, Movie Storm, and Movie Zoo.
Uh-huh.
So I mean, so they're almost like saying, yeah, we're recognizing these as machinima engines, even though maybe they're not really strictly in that really small definition of machinima.
Yeah.
I don't see that traditional definition of machinima that Ricky gave us. I don't see that as ever reaching a mainstream tipping point, simply because of all the copyright and licensing issues. If you're using someone else's sets and people and actions and so on, the moment you try and make $1 off of that, or it gets any kind of a wide audience, you can expect the suits to swoop in.
I think the legal side is really very interesting, and I think there may be a lot of hype and myth in the machinima community around how the games companies view it. Certainly. And I say that with some caution, because obviously I didn't interview every single game company here. But the overwhelming trend in the research that I did here was, well, I mean, what they were saying is that it's about primarily, it adds to our marketing effort, and that we could not, as games developers, achieve the kind of reach to our target audience without machinimators. And so it's a very fundamental part of the culture that is absorbed by the games developers, even though the current legal framework doesn't really support it. There isn't really a legal framework that exists at the moment that supports digital culture in any of its forms, and this is, kind of no different. But the games developers were very clear that they would be very unlikely to go after somebody that is creating content that is ultimately reaching their core market that they couldn't themselves actually reach with similar messages.
Well, look at assets, for instance. Source Filmmaker, as far as the viewership goes, the Source Filmmaker clips are getting the majority of them, probably because of that, the gamer culture thing. But right now, Valve has a place where you can download third-party assets. People upload those things, and it's hosted by Valve on Steam, right? And you can get things like Elizabeth from Bioshock BioShock Infinite, that's not a Valve game. And so basically they're hosting pirated or cracked versions of assets from competitors.
Didn't know that.
And they don't seem to have any trouble hosting that. I mean, they're legally, I don't think that's kosher, but Valve isn't doing a thing about it, and the owners of those assets are not doing a thing about it. But there's no like paperwork that says, oh, this is all okay. So it's still kind of like, if you can get away with it, you can get away with it, but it could stop at any time.
Right.
So it's a weird, mixed messaging where these things are floating around, and yet there's no explicit permission to use these things. And so you're always kind of nervous. Is this going to cause trouble by using that?
Phil,
as soon as there's an opportunity for profit, that's when you're going to see all the people making their arguments.
Yes. Yeah, you're right.
But even then, you're not seeing. I mean, there is profit made by machinimators. It's not direct profit, but it's indirect profit. If you're overlaying advertising on a YouTube channel or on your streams, then you are making money out of that. And there are examples of machinimators making a lot of money out of that sort of thing. Not necessarily the ones that you'd be tapping into in this community, but certainly in the Let's Play type communities. They're making huge amounts of money. And yet they are not, not necessarily within terms of service or, compliant with the end user license agreements as they are written with the games that they're actually playing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But the games developers seem to see it as what they would describe really as a symbiotic relationship. Some of the games developers even said they take the machinima content, they look at the stories that have been created and the way the characters might have been modified, and then they will take those ideas and incorporate them back into the game, maybe as downloadable content. So it's very much a two-way street. And I would say, really, who should be paying whom here? Just throw that into the mix, because I think it's far from clear cut.
Yeah.
Irrespective of what the suits might be saying.
Yeah.
The legal side's never really affected me very much. I early on when I was in the movies, there was a big thing about using copyright music, and that sort of slapped me in the face early on, and I've never tried to breach that in any sort of way. So I never really worried about stealing anything, because I generally don't. But I want to go back to the original thing about the trends of it, because my observation when I was in the movies, it was very popular. They were getting hundreds of movies being uploaded every day, and eventually that died, of course, because I guess the software was getting older and they weren't developing for it. And of course, I've seen the same thing with, I think Moviestorm did the same thing. John can tell me if I'm wrong or not, but it was very popular for a while, and that's now petering out as it's getting older. So I'm hoping that sort of this is what's happening right now, that we just happen to be in a trough with several pieces of software that may have been popular once but aren't anymore. I don't really know, because right now I'm seeing two things when I'm in the locations that I hang out at. The TM Underground is what I would used to consider home base, and it's almost dead there right now, and it's very sad. But on the other side, I'm over in the Reillusion forums where iClone does this stuff, and it's vibrant. It's quite a contrast between the two. So it's kind of mixed signals in a way. I don't really know what the hell's going on.
Tracy, you were going to say something? I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Well, I wonder to what extent the games are taking this scene back a little bit by incorporating some production tools back into the games now. It was a comment that came up with the games developers again, the ones that I interviewed, and they were quite keen to sort of say, yeah, we're listening to our fans and this is what we're doing. And so rather than using out of game production editing tools, by incorporating them back into the game, and then say, for example, making use of things like the Xbox One, which has a machinima.com tile on it where you push your content straight out to the Machinima forum. I wonder, to what extent they're just trying to recapture some of the market that moved to these other production tools a few years ago. I wonder if it's their way of actually just bringing it back in-house, so to speak. It's just a thought.
Right.
Well, the cinematic tools are often used by the developers themselves. Like if you look at Unity, they have a timeline, they have more audio track. It seems like the engines become more and more like a machinima tool as time goes on, but they're not thinking in terms of, oh, let's give people something where they can make a video, like unwashed masses. They're thinking developers. And so when you actually open up and try to use these cinematics inside the engine, it's really not as accessible as it should be. I mean, I've had a talk with the Unity people and asked them point blank, are you going to offer a true machinima tool set through the Unity editor? And they said no. But but like I said, just like Source Filmmaker was used internally by Valve to do cinematics. It's kind of an outgrowth of that. So the stub is sitting there and you can use it if you want, but in order to do that, you have to have a certain amount of technical proficiency. The tools are not meant to be that user-friendly.
Right.
But it doesn't really, I mean, there's such a short, it's a frustration on my part because I could see how easy it would be for them to just productize this, and they won't do it. I mean, Valve has the money to make Source Filmmaker that much easier than it is. Like, you play the game, you can shoot and do these things, and record that, but only Team Fortress 2. It's like there's all these kind of like limitations that wouldn't be there if they were thinking from the get-go,
Right.
Let's make it so that a 12-year-old could do it. Games are supposed to be easy, right?
Yeah.
So they add complexity back into it so that the type of people who are using these cinematic tools are trained on Maya or 3D Studio Max. So when you use, and I would include iClone in this, I mean, not to bash it, but the paradigm of how you animate, and even Movie Storm to some extent, to go in and manipulate the IK joints and everything manually is a slow workflow. And the reason I got into the extra normal was to thinking that it would be better to simulate, like The Sims, the basic stuff, the shifting back and forth, the eye saccades and so on, that you don't have to do that because a lot of these animations, and I think that affects how the view count is, it falls into that uncanny valley.
Yeah.
And I mean, back in the early 2000s, all this stuff was new. But these days, look at Dawn Planet of the Apes. I mean, the bar has been raised so much higher for what people constitute as entertainment that when they come back and they watch a Movie Storm clip, which is using an engine that's probably close to 10 years old, it's really hard for them to get into it.
Yeah.
But when you look at the game engines like the BioShock Infinites and stuff, they're so much above the dedicated tools. So there's a lot of kind of almost throwing darts and almost getting it right and not really getting the right tool. And I think that has played a part in the interest waning because, why would you make something if you didn't think people would watch it? And if it's very hard for me when I'm doing my extra normal stuff and I'm kind of wincing at the look of it, that I can't do anything about it because the assets are pre-built and it's using the ogre shader and it's aging and aging and aging, that there's nothing to take its place. So that, again, I'm kind of harping on the same tone of technology being at a cusp where, somebody somewhere, and, I have ideas, but I don't have backing, needs to make a contemporary tool that will do this properly. Probably using Unity because everybody's using Unity and it's so multi-platform. To give people a faster workflow. Like I saw a tutorial for Source Filmmaker on how to do a walk cycle. It was a half an hour long. I do not want to spend a half an hour to get my character to walk from one end of the room to the other. If I wanted a character in extra normal to walk, I just drop a marker and tell them to walk and tell them what gait to use. They slowly accelerate into it, and then they slow down. They'll even turn it. They'll do all these things because it's simulated. So Ricky, what you were talking about in the beginning about Machinima being real-time rendering, I think that is the fundamental misconception of the advantage of Machinima. It's not the render times per se. It's how long it takes you to drive that character to get them to do what you want it to do in a lifelike way.
So it's workflow. Workflow is what
yes,
you say.
yeah. If you're one person, I mean, it's expected that, and I have the most respect for people who do this kind of stuff, but they toil away.
Yeah.
If you wanted to do a Source Filmmaker clip where every single facial muscle is moving like in the ones that Valve make, you'll be spending months on it, to get every little control going, because you're doing everything yourself. And that workflow is the same exact workflow that you use if you were at Pixar or something else.
Right.
And so where the game should come in is to make these actors kind of more automated, like robotics.
Mhm.
So the naturalist movement, which they have to do in games anyway, whether it's using motion capture or procedural or something else, it's doing that on its own. And then you give it more coarser direction, which was the direction that Extra Normal was going in. And really nobody else has really taken that to the next level, I don't think.
Right.
I mean, I could see shades of that in Movie Zoo, shades of that in Movie Storm, but it uses a lot of cheats and also Plotagon. We haven't mentioned them.
Yeah.
But the problem with those is they tend to rely on canned motion capture. So if you do this, it's the exact same gesture over and over again. And you notice that kind of repetition over and so there's a point of diminishing returns in using pre-canned motion capture full body that just plays back exactly the same way every time. In 2014, there's no reason to be limited to those kind of crude techniques, but nobody's really gone in and say, I'm going to have a character that can emote, you know what I mean, in real time, and you can just tell them you're angry, you're sad, and every single time they do it, it'll be slightly different. The amount of R&D that went into The Sims, I mean, it was how many millions of dollars and years of R&D. And the same thing went with Extra Normal. One of the reasons it went out of business is they had 4 years of R&D where they were trying to do something much more advanced. And so they were starting to go down that path, and they said, okay, ship it. So where I came in is I just tried to add in those missing pieces or unlock some of those missing pieces that were dumbed down in order to appeal to the lowest common denominator. So where I'm left with that company failing is thinking, wow, this is untapped potential. It could be done. And I actually think that given enough time, that's where we're going to head. So Valve's tools, why did they add lip sync to it? They needed cinematics, so they added the facial morphs and all these things that you normally wouldn't use in a game. Now it's not that rare for characters to have full lip sync, but it was kind of revolutionary at the time. They added the face poser and all of that kind of thing because they wanted games to be more cinematic, but within the context of a game, not just to do cinematics. So the next leap is, can game engines just be used as straight cinematic tools instead of it? Because the downside, when I look at Hugh Hancock, as hard as he's worked to try to make, perfect his own tool set, it's been this moving target, and he's not getting there because he's not a coder, he's not building anything, he's just trying to use the stuff that's trickling down, the motion capture suits and everything. And in the meantime, years are going by that if he were to do it in 3D Studio Max, he'd be done already. So that's been my experience. Is I go into it thinking I'm going to save time, and I wind up spending more time because the technology is not as far along as it should be.
What can you tell us about how we can expand and improve on the Expo next year?
Well, I think you should steer clear of bringing in other animation forms, to be honest, because you've got something unique here. You've got a Machinima Expo, and as far as I know, that's the only Machinima Expo out there. There are plenty of other animation festivals, and I know I've said this before, but there are plenty of other animation festivals and film festivals that can take animations, but there's only one Machinima Expo, and I think you should stay focused on Machinima. How to bring your numbers up? Promotion, wonderful. John, how many films were in the source film thing? Do you know in the Saxy?
I'm
guessing
not
there are a
sure
lot.
overall. I didn't get a tally of it, but there were a lot, and there was some that weren't even nominated. That I thought there was one film that had the largely was comprised of two characters in like a hand-to-hand combat thing. I couldn't believe it was made with the engine. I mean, it was like an animation. It was choreographed. It was well shot. The camera angles was, and people were just kind of dismissing it because it's just two guys fighting. It's like that. I don't think they got it. It blew my mind what the guy did, and I thought maybe it was just stock animation that he'd done somehow, but I didn't see anything approaching that in any of the other films. But
Okay, so I think it's like Tracy was saying that the machinima is out there. We just don't know where it is, or we don't know how to access it. So I think that you'd probably need to focus on trying to worm your way into these other places.
So can I get your phone number, Phil? Because if we decide to do only machinima and I get 32 entries, you're going to need to make up the difference with 30 films. So.
I'll just re-edit Haunter of the Dark in 2 different ways.
Make it a series.
A series, that's right. I'll cut it down into 1 minute chunks.
Ricky, you're getting all the films I haven't submitted next year.
I thank you all for being here today and for talking with me. Glenn, thanks for showing up and being a part of a festival that you've only just recently gotten involved in. I appreciate that. And Tracy, congratulations again on your report. I urge everybody to read that. It's a real eye-opener. And again, thanks for being here today.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Ricky.
you.
Thank you.
Never
Sure. If you have any additional comments or something